Good evening, everyone. I'm Carla Weinhold, and I'm going to be working with you tonight on the webinar called Question and Inquire, Advance and Develop Inquiry Through Essential Questions. I am a 7th grade ancient history teacher. I teach in Harford County, Maryland, which is about 20 miles north of Baltimore. I've been teaching for about 22 years, and most of that has now been in middle school social studies. I did teach the early part of my career in elementary school, and as a middle school teacher, I always use and like the inquiry model of C3 because I think it's a natural lesson style that helps my kids connect with the content that I'm teaching. I have to accept the fact, unfortunately, that every kid that walks into my classroom is not going to enter as a lover of history and unfortunately sometimes not leave as a lover of history. But if I can help them learn to think critically, learn to question their learning and question their experiences, then I have helped them facilitate their success as they continue to go through the rest of their schooling, and then hopefully helping them be a functioning member of society when they enter adulthood. I want to give my students the opportunity to be an active learner in history rather than just the traditional passive observer sitting there and watching or learning about. I want them to take an active part in what we're learning. So our objective for tonight is to help you better understand how Dimension 1 of the C3 framework can support an inquiry-based approach to instruction, and by utilizing essential questions with your students to be able to do that. At any point, if there are questions, concerns that come up, please use the chat feature. Jessica will be monitoring that to see if there's anything and be able to chime in so we can address your questions as they arise. So I want you to think about the quote that you see on the screen. If you do not know how to ask the right question, you discover nothing. I want you to think about the students that, for most of you, had in your classroom today or will see in your classroom tomorrow, or for me, the students that I see next week. And think about, do they know how to ask questions? Are they only able to ask those literal questions that get that one answer? And then if they can't or aren't able to ask those questions, what am I as a teacher doing to help them learn how to ask the right questions? Too many times, I think we as teachers find ourselves asking all the questions or guiding our students to a destination that we set and we pick. However, we need to start thinking about giving our students the freedom to ask their own questions, even if that means they take us down a path that was different than the one that we had envisioned and planned on. We need to create opportunities for them to think and wonder about the content and be able to express those concerns and questions and wonderings, whether it's about the content, whether it's about the source that they're looking at. So let's start with the term essential question. So I want you to use the chat feature and share what comes to mind when you hear of the concept essential questions. And I know for a lot of us, the essential questions that we see come in our curriculum from our district, and they have that overarching question that we need to kind of look at and explore through our unit of instruction. There's an article posted with ASCD, an article written by Jay McTeague and Grant Wiggins, that share that if you are creating and looking at essential questions, they're not questions that can be answered in one lesson or one activity. They're designed to stimulate our students' thinking, spark more questions. They should help our students dig deeper into the content. So when you're thinking about the different kinds of questions and the purpose, are we asking leading questions? They usually have one answer. It's usually simple recall. Is it probing? Are we pushing and guiding them down the path towards an answer or an idea that we want them to find? Is it a guiding question, asking for some sort of explanation? Maybe there's not just one right answer. Or are you asking questions to kind of hook or spark their interest? So if you think about a hook example, a simple, do you agree with the stand your ground laws? If you're looking at that for a leading question, or what's the Second Amendment? Guiding them towards an exploration. So a guiding question, does the Second Amendment support the stand your ground laws according to the courts? Whereas an essential question could be looking at where's the balance between personal freedoms and the common good? Are there amendments that should be considered out of date? They're broader and asking them to look more at guiding them down the right path. So I see Paul shared a guiding learning for unit of instruction. Laura shared essential questions, shine a spotlight on the goal of the instruction. So if we look at and think back to when you were a kid, and you like to do those connect the dot puzzles, and you always tried to make your lines exactly where they needed to be because you wanted to figure out what the mystery image would be. Using essential questions is very much like that dot puzzle, trying to figure out what that major piece of the mystery concept is. So our job as teachers is to help develop questioning skills in our students so they can uncover the hidden picture, to help them develop the skills of inquiry that fit all the pieces of all of the lessons together, but most importantly, letting them discover the hidden concept rather than just giving them the hidden concept. So if we look at the quote from the Harvard Education Letter, when students know how to ask their own questions, they take greater ownership of their learning. They deepen their comprehension. So when we have our students and give our students the opportunity to take ownership of the learning, then they're going to have a better understanding of the concept, the greater concept for the unit. So we need help to develop the skills to ask questions. So look at the two questions on the right, and using the chat feature, can you share which one that you think is actually the essential question? Great, thanks, Laura. Number one is definitely more the essential question. It's broader, it's sparking that other questions that our students can ask. So when we look as teachers, how do we get our students to the stage of asking good questions? How do we get them away from asking, what is the Second Amendment? Or just those very simple, literal, right there in the text questions? How do I make sure they ask the right question? Are there ever really any bad questions that students ask? And I know for some of the teachers, what if nobody asks a question? What if I get those blank stares back at me, those blank deer in headlights looks like, what do you mean I have to ask those questions? So when you're working with your students, building that climate, that safety, that they feel safe enough to take that risk and ask those questions. One of the things that I use with my students is a bookmark similar to the one that you have on the screen, where it gives them question stems. And I encourage them to go for those higher level questions. So just using Bloom's taxonomy. So by putting a bookmark, I tape it. I happen to teach, I'm very lucky that I teach in a room that has one-to-one devices. So when we're doing our questioning, I happen to just tape it to the side of the computer screen. So while they're working and annotating in their reading, those question stems are there, easily accessible. And then if they don't know how to formulate the question, there's some ideas that they can come up with. So if we look at This phase there's an article, The Right Way to Implement Essential Questions by Grant Wiggins. He looks at the 4-step process, how to teach them to create these questions. So it's a wonderful article that you can use with your students and reference as well. I like to have my students annotate. I like for them to comment, write all over articles. There are a lot of active classroom platform pieces that they can annotate on the right-hand side while they're reading, even though it's a digital source. It's easy when it's an article. I can give them a paper copy and they can write all over it, highlight, draw arrows, draw little pictures. However, when it's a map or it's an image, it makes it a little bit harder. So I like to give my students a graphic organizer. So the one that is at the top right-hand side of the screen, where they just simply, what's the topic? What are they looking at? For example, if they're looking at a map of the United States, then main idea. Okay, what's the big idea if it's the population of the 1800s map? And then what details, what facts can they get from that map? And then thoughts, comments, and most importantly, questions that they have while they're looking at that particular map or while they're looking at the tangible artifact, if we can get artifacts in their hands. So we all have different strategies. These are different kinds of questioning strategies that were shared through a source called Mind Tools. You've got the open and closed. I like open and closed wording rather than convergent and divergent. I think that my students understand what an open question is versus a closed question is. So I do some direct instruction on how the different types of questioning. What kind of questions are they asking? Looking at our drill question only takes a few minutes. Referring back to the drill question, is this an open question or a closed question? So it doesn't have to be necessarily a full blown out lesson, but something that you can address and blend within your instruction. So I oftentimes will have my students brainstorm questions as a group, then go back and label question as open or closed. If they feel they have more of one type, say they have more closed questions, then I'll encourage them, hey, come up with as a group, come up with some more open questions so you can have and use those for a discussion later. I use the leading questions and probing questions when I want my students to kind of expand or dig deeper. And I like to give my students a lot of time to be able to hear the questions of others. So these are some pictures of some students that were doing a C3 lesson. So I had them exploring the role of cathedrals in the Middle Ages. And most of my students before this lesson had no idea what a cathedral even was. So I knew we had to build a lot of background knowledge. So there was a background essay built into the It's Learning C3 lesson, or excuse me, not It's Learning Active Classroom, sorry. So I had my students read the article the first time strictly just to figure out what a cathedral and just a general informational read. Then I had them read it a second time just to annotate comments, questions while they were reading. And then as a group, they put all those questions together. So, and here are some videos of my students at kind of that second stage after they had kind of annotated on their own. So I'll play a couple of these for you. Maybe, there it goes.
Well, this is how I write.
And what you'll see if you looked at the beginning is the young girl on the bottom left was going back to the article, and that's something that we did a lot of instruction throughout the year. We do a lot of writing and document-based analysis. So working with them to go back to the article. Here's another one.
Who do natural disasters affect the peoples in the area they're in? Tackle that one. Geographic. Okay. How did disasters affect the people?
So in this last one, they kind of clarified with each other as they were writing. So this is kind of the end result of some of the groups where they put general wonder questions and then they specified kind of what did they want to know. Some did it kind of a more linear, like the middle picture. The upper right-hand corner, they all had people writing everywhere else. And then what I like to do with some of my students, and depending on the lesson and the purpose of the lesson, is then have them kind of respond after we do the lesson, go back to those questions, but go back to another group's question to kind of respond or ask further probing questions. So let's kind of take a look at how this could look like in your classroom with your students tomorrow. So one of the active classroom activities that I really like is the decision-making lessons, because they lend themselves to a lot of inquiry and discussions. And when I'm doing a lot of inquiry and exploration and questions, I like to have my students have the opportunity to put those questions into practice. So, for example, if I'm starting to with civilizations, I could start with this particular slide, giving them pictures and asking them, where do you want to live? Having them decide where they want to settle, and then forming them into groups for each of those 5 pictures and discuss, okay, why did you pick that one? Why did you not pick one of the other ones? Did geography or anything impact why you picked that particular picture? And then giving them questions to explore about their image. Why do you want to settle there? Some questions that they can decide as their warm-up. Then I would go and give them the actual active classroom decision-making text. This one is the where would you settle. Another reason I like the decision-making is there's 2 levels of text. So I have level 1 for my students who might be struggling a little more with their reading, where level 2 is going to give them more meat, but both readings are going to give the kids the information that they're going to need. So I like to connect back to my elementary days and a sticky note strategy, whether or not they use sticky notes or whether or not they actually put the actual little kind of emoji or symbol to help. Like, I'm wondering why somebody would want to settle in this particular place, or this is confusing. So then the third step would be for the group to actually go back to those questions, especially that essential question on if you could live anywhere, where would you live, to see how was their thinking changed or challenged. Floating between the groups, helping them facilitate that conversation and those questions, having them look closely at the civilizations that they read. And then I would actually have them participate in the decision making, where they have to convince me using their evidence on where I should settle based on their arguments. And I stand in the middle of the room, and if they give me a good question or something to think about or something that convinces me, I move actually physically closer to that particular group. And wherever I'm closest with at the end of the time, that's the group that had the strongest arguments for the lesson. So I encourage you to start small. So the art of teaching is the art of assisting discovery. You are helping your students on this new pathway. So think about that beginning of the unit of study. Maybe you don't share the essential question that the district gives you, but maybe you give the students an index card. We're studying a unit on ancient Greece, and have the students come up with what the essential question should be for the unit. And you can post these on a bulletin board, on your doorway, and revisit them, and then use those for your review at the end of the unit. So I bring us back to that question from the very beginning. If you don't know how to ask the right question, you discover nothing. So if we don't give our students the chance to learn how to ask the right questions, we're doing them a disservice and not preparing them to be those productive members of society. So hopefully tonight I gave you a better understanding of how Dimension 1 of the C3 can support the inquiry-based approach to instruction. I know there are additional blogs that are coming out in relation to Dimension 1 of C3. If you're not familiar with our micro-credentials, there'll be micro-credentials coming up. So all to help teachers be more successful with the elements of the C3 framework in their instruction. So I want you to think these last few minutes and share using the chat feature how your thinking was changed. Was there something that confirmed your thinking? And or is there something that you plan on taking back and using with your students tomorrow? So as you're thinking about those, I hope you took something away that you can use with your students tomorrow, or in my case, next week when I see my kiddos. But thank you. I know teachers value their time. So thank you for all you do for your students. So I hope you've taken something valuable away. And I'm going to turn it back over to you, Jessica.